Today we are going to discuss about the India's external relations. What does independence consist of? It consists fundamentally and basically of foreign relations. That is the test of independence. All else local autonomy. Once foreign relations go out of your hands into the charge of somebody else, to that extent and in that measure, you are not independent. ये quote किसने दिया था? जवाहरलाल नेहरू ने during a debate in the Constituent Assembly in March 1949. Here you can see leaders of some countries. यहाँ पे नेहरू with Nkrumah from Ghana, Nasser from Egypt, and Sukarno from Indonesia and Tito from Yugoslavia at a meeting of non-aligned nations, New York में October 1960 में. These five comprised the core leadership of the non-alignment movement. ठीक है. Thus far we have focused in this book on the developments within the country had and on domestic challenges. In the previous chapter we now turn to the external challenges. Here too our leaders faced the challenge with an innovative response by way of the policy of non-alignment, but they also found themselves in conflict with the neighbors. This led to the three wars in 1962, 1965 and 1971. These wars and the external relations in general were shaped by and had their impact on the politics in the country. In this chapter we study the story of this relationship between the external and the internal politics by focusing on the international context that shaped India's external relations, the operational principles that informed the country's foreign policy, the history of India's relations with the China and Pakistan, and the evolution of India's nuclear policy. Now, India's external relations, international context में, India was born in a very trying and challenging international context. The world had witnessed a devastating war and was grappling with the issues of reconstruction. Yet another attempt to establish an international body was underway. Many new countries were emerging as a result of the collapse of colonialism, and most new nations were trying to come to terms with the twin challenges of welfare and democracy. Free India's foreign policy reflected all these concerns in the period immediately after independence. Apart from these factors, at the global level, India had its own share of concerns. The British government left behind the legacy of many international disputes. Partition created its own pressures, and the task of poverty alleviation was already waiting for the fulfillment. This was the overall context in which India started participating in the world affairs as an independent nation state. As a nation born in the backdrop of the World War, India decided to conduct its foreign relations with an aim to respect the sovereignty of all other nations and to achieve security through the maintenance of peace. And this aims finds an echo in the directive principle of state policy. Just as both internal and external factors guide the behavior of an individual or a family, both domestic and international environment influence the foreign policy of a nation, and the developing countries lack the required resources to effectively advocate their concerns in the international system, so they pursue more modest goals than the advanced states. They focus more on the peace and development in their own neighborhood. Moreover, their economic and security dependence on the more powerful states occasionally influences their foreign policy. In the period immediately after the Second World War, many developing nations immediately after the Second World War, many developing nations close to support the foreign policy preferences of the powerful countries who were given them aid or credits, and this resulted in the division of countries of the world into two clear camps. One was under the influence of the United States and its western allies, and the other was under the influence of the then Soviet Union. You have read about this in the book of on the contemporary world politics. You have read there about the experiment called the non-aligned movement. As you also read there, the end of the Cold War changed the context of international relations entirely. But when India achieved its freedom and started framing its foreign policy, the Cold War was just beginning, and the world was getting divided into these two camps. Did India belong to any of these two camps in the global politics of the 50s and the 60s? Was it successful in conducting its foreign policy peacefully and avoiding international conflicts? Now here we can see the constitutional principles. Article 51 of the Indian Constitution lays down some directive principle of state policy on promotion of international peace and security. The state shall endeavor to promote international peace and security, maintain maintain just and honorable relations between the nations, foster respect for the international law and treaty obligations in the dealings of organized people with one another, and encourage a settlement of international dispute by the arbitration. How well did the Indian state live up to these principles in the first 2 decades after the independence? You may come back to this question after reading this chapter. Cold War was just beginning and the world was getting divided into these two camps. Did India belong to any of these two camps in the global politics of the 50s and the 60s? Was it successful in conducting its foreign policy peacefully and avoiding international conflicts? Now here it is the fourth chapter, and it's Nehru once again. Was he a superman or what, or has his role been glorified? The policy of non-alignment. The Indian national movement was not an isolated process, it was a part of the worldwide struggle against colonialism and imperialism. It influenced the liberation movements of many Asian and African countries. Prior to India's independence, there were contracts between the nationalist leaders of India and those of the other colonies, united as they were in their common struggle against the colonialism and the imperialism. The creation of the Indian National Army INA by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose during the Second World War was the clearest manifestation of the linkages established between India and overseas Indians during the freedom struggle also. The foreign policy of a nation reflects the interplay of domestic and external factors. Therefore, the noble ideals that inspired India's struggle for the freedom influenced the making of its foreign policy, but India's attainment of independence coincided with the beginning of the Cold War era. As you read in the first chapter of the book, Contemporary World Politics, this period was marked by the political, economic, and military confrontation at the global level between the two blocs led by the superpowers, the US and the USSR. And the same period also witnessed developments like the establishment of the UN, the creation of nuclear weapons, the emergence of communist China, and the beginning of the decolonization. So India's leadership had to pursue its national interests within the prevailing international contexts. Now Nehru's role. The first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru played a crucial role in setting the national agenda. He was his own foreign minister, thus both as the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. He exercised profound influence in the formulation and implementation of India's foreign policy from 1946 to 1960. And the three major objectives of Nehru's foreign policy were to preserve the hard-earned sovereignty, protect territorial integrity, and promote rapid economic development. Nehru wished to achieve these objectives through the strategy of non-alignment, and there were, of course, parties and groups in the country that believed that India should be more friendly with the bloc led by the US, because that bloc claimed to be pro-democracy. Among those who thought on these lines were leaders like Dr. Ambedkar. Some political parties which were opposed to the communism also wanted India to follow a pro-US foreign policy, and these included the Bharatiya Jan Sangh and later the Swatantra Party, but Nehru possessed considerable leeway in formulating the foreign policy. Here what we can see, our general policy is to avoid entanglement in the power politics and not to join any group of the powers as against any other group. And the two leading groups today are the Russian bloc and the Anglo-American bloc. We must be friendly to both and yet not join either. Both America and Russia are extraordinarily suspicious of each other as well as of other countries. And this makes our path difficult, and we may well be suspected by each of the leaning towards the other. This cannot be helped. ये है जवाहरलाल नेहरू, लेटर टू KPS Menon, January 1947 में उन्होंने लिखा था. Now, distance from the two camps. The foreign policy of independent India vigorously pursued the dream of a peaceful world by advocating the policy of non-alignment, by them reducing Cold War tensions, and by contributing human resources to the UN peacekeeping operations. And you might ask why India did not join either of the two camps during the Cold War era. India wanted to keep away from the military alliances led by the US and Soviet Union against each other. As you read in this book, Contemporary World Politics, during the Cold War, the US-led North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact came into existence. India advocated non-alignment as the ideal foreign policy approach, and this was a difficult balancing act, and sometimes the balance did not appear perfect. In 1956, when Britain attacked Egypt over the Suez Canal issue, India led the world protest against this new colonial invasion. But in the same year, when the USSR invaded Hungary, India did not join its public condemnation. And despite such a situation, by and large, India did take an independent stand on the various international issues and could get aid and assistance from the members of both the blocs. Now, while India was trying to convince the other developing countries about the policy of non alignment, Pakistan joined the US led military alliances, and the US was not happy about India's independent initiatives and the policy of non alignment. Therefore, there was a considerable unease in the Indo US relations during the 1950s, and the US also resented India's growing partnership with the Soviet Union. You have studied in the last chapter the strategy of planned economic development adopted by the India, and this policy emphasized import substitution, and the emphasis on the developing a resource base also mean that export oriented growth was limited, and this development strategy limited India's economic interaction with the outside world. इधर जो next है वो क्या है? Did we have more recognition and power in the world when we were younger, poorer and more vulnerable than now? Isn't that strange? उसके बाद जो next है वो क्या है? A country without material men or money, the three means of power, is now fast coming to be recognized as the biggest moral power in the civilized world. Her word listened to with respect in these councils of the great. C. Rajgopalachari letter to Edwina Mountbatten 1950 में. इधर जो है ये क्या है? Afro-Asian unity. Yet, given you have studied in the last chapter the strategy of planned economic development adopted by the India, and this policy emphasized import substitution. The emphasis on the developing resource base also meant that export-oriented growth was limited, and this development strategy limited India's economic interaction with the outside world. इधर है Afro-Asian unity. Yet, given its size, location, and power potential, Nehru envisaged a major role for the India in the world affairs and especially in the Asian affairs. His era was marked by the establishment of contacts between India and other newly independent states in the Asia and Africa. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Nehru had been an ardent advocate of Asian unity. Under his leadership, India convened the Asian Relations Conference in March 1947. 5 months ahead of attaining its independence, India made earnest efforts for the early realization of freedom of Indonesia from the Dutch colonial regimes by convening an international conference in 1949 to support its freedom struggle. India was a staunch supporter of the decolonization process and firmly opposed racism, especially apartheid in the South Africa and the Afro-Asian Conference held in the Indonesia city of Bandung in 1955. Commonly known as the Bandung Conference, marked the zenith of India's engagement with the newly independent Asian and African nations. The Bandung Conference later led to the establishment of the NAM, and the first summit of the NAM was held in Belgrade in September 1961. Nehru was a co-founder of the NAM. ठीक है, उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है? Peace and conflict with the China. Unlike the relationship with the Pakistan, Free India began its relationship with the China on a very friendly note. After the Chinese Revolution in 1949, India was one of the first countries to recognize the communist government. Nehru felt strongly for this neighbor that was coming out of the shadow of the Western domination and helped the new government in the international fora. And some of his colleagues like Vallabhbhai Patel were worried about its possible were worried about a possible Chinese aggression in the future, but Nehru thought it was exceedingly unlikely that India will face an attack from the China. For a very long time, the Chinese border was guarded by the paramilitary forces, not the army. And the joint enunciation of the Panchashil, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence by the Indian Prime Minister Nehru and the Chinese Premier Johu in Lai on 29 April 1954 was a step in the direction of stronger relationship between them two countries. Indian and Chinese leaders visited each other's countries and were greeted by the large and friendly crowds. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट ये क्या है? तिब्बत दिखाया गया है. The plateau of the Central Asian regions, called the Tibet, is one of the major issues that historically caused tension between India and China. From time to time in history, China had claimed administrative control over the Tibet, and from time to time, Tibet was independent too. In 1950, China took over control of Tibet. Large sections of the Tibetan population opposed this takeover. India tried to persuade China to recognize Tibet's claims for independence. When the Panchshil Agreement was signed between India and China in 1954, through one of its clauses about respecting each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, India considered China claims over Tibet, and the Tibetan spiritual leader Dalai Lama accompanied the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai during the official Chinese visit to India in 1956. He informed Nehru about the worsening situation worsening situation in Tibet, but China had already assured India that Tibet will be given greater autonomy than the enjoyed by any other regions of China in 1958. There was armed uprising in the Tibet against China's occupation. This was suppressed by the Chinese forces, sensing that the situation had become worse in 1959, and the Dalai Lama crossed over into Indian border and sought asylum, which was granted. And the Chinese government strongly protested against this. Over the last half century, a large number of Tibetans have also sought refuge in India and many other countries of the world. In India, particularly in Delhi, there are large settlement of Tibetan refugees. Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh is perhaps the largest refugee settlements of Tibetans in India. The Dalai Lama has also made Dharamshala his home in India. In the 1950s and 1960s, many political leaders and parties in India, including the Socialist Party and the Jan Sangh, supported the cause of Tibet's independence. China has created the Tibet Autonomous Region, which is an integral part of China. Tibetans oppose the Chinese claim that the Tibet is part of Chinese territory, and they also oppose the policy of bringing into Tibet more and more Chinese settlers. Tibetans dispute China's claims that autonomy is granted to the region. They think that China wants to undermine the traditional religion and culture of the Tibet. ये है इंडो चाइना बॉर्डर सी जियांग ऑटोनॉमस रीजन सिंगयांग इधर जो है ये लिखा हुआ है लुक इफ एनी अनटूवर्ड इंसिडेंट occurs now the responsibility will be entirely yours. ठीक है ये है इंडियन टेरिटरी ये है चाइना बॉर्डर डिस्प्यूट्स विद चाइना इरप्टेड इन 1960 टॉक्स बिटवीन नेहरू एंड माओ सेटुंग प्रूव्ड फ्यूटाइल इधर जो है ये क्या दिखाया गया है बहुत सारी चीज़ें दिखाई गई हैं पर एक पर्सन के बारे में बताया गया है वी.के. कृष्णा मेनन 1897 to 1974 डिप्लोमेट एंड मिनिस्टर एक्टिव इन द लेबर पार्टी in the UK between 1934 to 1947, Indian High Commissioner in the UK and later head of India's delegation to UN Rajya Sabha MP and later Lok Sabha MP, member of the Union Cabinet from 1956, Defense Minister since 1957, considered very close to Nehru, resigned after the India-China war in 1962. इसने रिजाइन कर दिया था आफ्टर इंडिया चाइना वॉर के बाद. इधर जो है ये क्या है इधर है ये फ्रेंकली माई impression of Zhou and Lai was very favorable. The Chinese premier is, I believe, a good type of man and trustworthy. C. Rajgopalachari in a letter December 1956 में ये मिला है. ये बच्चा क्या बोल रहा है I heard it from my grandfather. Nehru ji cried in public when Lata Mangeshkar sang ए मेरे वतन के लोगो after the 1962 war. ठीक है इधर जो है ये क्या है द चाइनीज इन्वेजन 1962 टू डेवलपमेंट स्ट्रेन दीज रिलेशनशिप चाइना annexed तिब्बत in 1950 and thus removed a historical buffer between the two countries. Initially the government of India did not oppose this openly, but as more information came in about the suppression of Tibetan culture, the Indian government grew uneasy and the Tibetan spiritual leader the Dalai Lama sought and obtained political asylum in the India in 1959. China alleged then the government of India was allowing anti-China activities to take place from within India. A little earlier, a boundary dispute had surfaced between India and China, and China said that any colonial decision did not apply. The main dispute was about the western and the eastern end of the long border. China claimed two areas within the Indian territory, Aksai Chin area in the Ladakh region of Jammu and Kashmir and much of the state of Arunachal Pradesh in the what was then called NEFA, Northeastern Frontier Agency, between 1957 and 1959. The Chinese occupied the Aksai Chin area and built a strategic road there. Despite a very long correspondence and discussion among top leaders, these differences could not be resolved. Several small borders skirmishes between the armies of the two countries took place. Do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in Chapter 1 of the Contemporary World Politics? While the entire world's attention was and massive invasion in October 1962 on both the disputed regions, the first attack lasted 1 week and Chinese forces captured some key areas in Arunachal Pradesh, and the second wave of attack came next month, while the Indian forces could block the Chinese advances on the western front in the Ladakh. In the east, the Chinese managed to advance nearly to the entry point of Assam Plains. Finally, China declared a unilateral ceasefire, and its troops withdrew to where they were before the invasion began. The China war dented India's image at home and abroad, India had to approach the Americans and the British for the military assistance to tide over the crisis, and the Soviet Union remained neutral during the conflict. It induced a sense of national humiliation, and at the same time strengthened a spirit of nationalism. Some of the top army commanders either resigned or were retired. Nehru's close associate and the then Defense Minister V. Krishna Menon had to leave the cabinet. Nehru's own stature suffered as he was severely criticized for his naive assessment of the Chinese intentions and the lack of military preparedness. For the first time, a no confidence motion against his government was moved and debated in the Lok Sabha. Soon thereafter, the Congress lost some key by elections to Lok Sabha. The political mood of the country had begun to change. इधर जो है ये क्या है, साइनो इंडियन रिलेशन सिंस 1962. इट टुक मोर देन अ डेकेड फॉर इंडिया एंड चाइना टू रिज्यूम नॉर्मल relations. It was in 1976 that full diplomatic relations were restored between the two countries. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the first top-level leader. He was then External Affairs Minister to visit China in 1979. Later, Rajiv Gandhi became the first Prime Minister after Nehru to visit China, and since then the emphasis is more on the trade relations between the two countries. In the book Contemporary World Politics, you have already read about these developments. The Sino-Indian conflicts affected the opposition as well. They sent the growing rift between the China and the Soviet Union created irreconcilable differences within the Communist Party of India (CPI) and the pro-USSR faction remained within the CPI and moved towards closer ties with the Congress. The other faction was for some times closer to China and was against any ties with the Congress, and the party split in 1964, and the leaders of the latter faction formed the Communist Party of India (Marxist CPIM). In the wake of China War, many leaders of what became CPIM were arrested for being pro-China. The war with China alerted the Indian leadership to the volatile situation in the northeast region. Apart from being isolated and extremely underdeveloped, this region also presented India with the challenge of national integration and political unity, and the process of its reorganization began soon after the China War. Nagaland was granted statehood. Manipur and Tripura, though union territories, were given the right to elect their own legislative assemblies. ये क्या है हकीकत, a small platoon of Indian army is rescued by the gypsies in Ladakh region, and the enemy has surrounded their post. Captain Bahadur Singh and his gypsy girlfriend Kamo helped the Jawans vacate their posts. Both Bahadur Singh and Kamo die while resisting the Chinese, but the Jawans too are overpowered by the enemy and lay down their lives for the country. Set in the backdrop of the China War of 1962, this film portrays a soldier and his travails and as its central theme. It pays tribute to the soldiers while depicting their plight and the political frustration over the betrayal by the Chinese. The film uses documentary footage of war scenes and is considered as one of the early war films made in Hindi. ठीक है, इधर जो है ये ईयर 1964 दे रखा है. डायरेक्टर चेतन आनंद, एक्ट्रेस धर्मेंद्र प्रिया, राजवंश, बलराज साहनी, जयंत सुधीर, संजय खान, विजय आनंद. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है, why do we say India and Pakistan had a war? Leaders quarrel and armies fight wars. Most ordinary citizens have nothing to do with these. इधर हो गया था, हमने डिस्कस कर लिया था. The Sino-Indian conflict affected the opposition. The China War dented India's image at home and abroad. India had to approach the Americans and the British for the military assistance. The conflict, it induced a sense of national humiliation and at the same time strengthened a spirit of nationalism. Some of the top army commanders either resigned or were retired. Nehru's close associate and the then Defense Minister V. Krishna Menon had to leave the cabinet. Nehru's own stature suffered as he was severely criticized for his naive assessments of the Chinese intentions and the lack of military preparedness. For the first time, a no confidence motion against his government has moved and debated in the Lok Sabha. Soon thereafter, the Congress lost some key by-elections to Lok Sabha. The political mood of the country had begun to change. इधर जो next है वो क्या है, the Sino-Indian conflict affected the opposition as well. This and the growing rift between China and the Soviet Union created irreconcilable differences within the Communist Party of India, and the pro-USSR faction remained within the CPI and moved towards closer ties with the Congress. And the other faction was for sometimes closer to the China and was against any ties with the Congress. The party split in 1964, and the leaders of the latter faction formed the Communist Party of the India (Marxist CPIM). In the wake of the China War, many leaders of what became CPIM were arrested for being pro-China. The war with the China alerted the Indian leadership to the volatile situation in the northeast region. Apart from being isolated isolated and extremely underdeveloped. This region also presented India with the challenge of national integration and political unity. And the process of its reorganization began soon after the China War, and Nagaland was granted statehood. Manipur and Tripura, though यूनियन टेरिटरीज वर गिवन द राइट टू इलेक्ट देयर ओन लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबलीज. उधर जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है, इधर जो है नेक्स्ट ये है, वाई डू वी से इंडिया एंड पाकिस्तान हैड अ वॉर, लीडर्स क्वारल एंड आर्मीज फाइट वॉर्स, मोस्ट ऑर्डिनरी सिटीजन्स हैव नथिंग टू डू विद दीज. इधर जो है ये क्या है, वॉर्स एंड पीस विद द पाकिस्तान. In the east of Pakistan, the conflict started just after partition over the dispute on the Kashmir. You will read more about the dispute in chapter 8. A proxy war broke out between the Indian and Pakistani armies in the Kashmir during 1947 itself. But this did not turn into a full war. The issue was then referred to the UN. Pakistan soon emerged as a critical factor in India's relations with the US and subsequently with China. The Kashmir conflict did not prevent cooperation between the governments of India and Pakistan. Both the governments worked together to restore the women abducted during the partition to their original families. A long-term dispute about the sharing of the river waters was resolved through the mediation by the World Bank, and the India-Pakistan Indus Waters Treaty was signed by Nehru and General Ayub Khan in 1960. Despite all ups and downs in the Indo-Pak relations, this treaty was worked well. A more serious armed conflict between the two countries began in 1965, as you would read in the next chapter. By then, Lal Bahadur Shastri had taken over as the Prime Minister. In April 1965, Pakistan launched armed attacks in the run of Kutch area of Gujarat, and this was followed by a bigger offensive in the Jammu and Kashmir. In August-September, Pakistani rulers were hoping to get support from the local population there, but it did not happen. In order to ease the pressure on the Kashmir front, Shastri ordered Indian troops to launch a counter-offensive on the Punjab border. In a fierce battle, the Indian army reached close to the Lahore, and the hostilities came to an end with the UN intervention. Later, Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and Pakistan's General Ayub Khan signed the Tashkent Agreement, brokered by the Soviet Union in January 1966. Though India could inflict considerable military loss on the Pakistan, the 1965 war added to India's already difficult economic situation. Bangladesh War 1971. Beginning in the 1970s, Pakistan faced its biggest internal crisis, and the country's first general election produced a split verdict. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's parties emerged a winner in the West Pakistan, while the Awami League, led by the Sheikh Mujib-ur-Rahman, swept through the East Pakistan. The Bengali population of East Pakistan had voted to protest against years of being treated as second-class citizens by the rulers based in the West Pakistan. The Pakistani rulers were not willing to accept the democratic verdict, nor were they ready to accept the Awami League's demand for a federation. Instead, in early 1971, the Pakistani army arrested Sheikh Mujib and unleashed a reign of terror on the people of East Pakistan. In response to the people started a struggle to liberate Bangladesh from the Pakistan. Throughout 1971, India had to bear the burden of about 80 lakh refugees who fled East Pakistan and took shelter in the neighboring areas in India. India extended moral and material support to the freedom struggle in Bangladesh. Pakistan accused India of a conspiracy to break it up. This sounds like joining the Soviet bloc. Can we say that we were non-aligned even after signing this treaty with the Soviet Union? इधर जो है ये क्या है, फास्ट फॉरवर्ड कारगिल कन्फ्रंटेशन. इन द अर्ली पार्ट ऑफ 1999, several points of the Indian side of the LOC in the Moshok, Dras Kaksar and Batalik areas were occupied by forces claiming to be Mujahideens. Thank you. In the early part of 1999, several points on the Indian side of the LOC in the Mashok, Dras, Kaksar and Batalik areas were occupied by forces claiming to be Mujahideen. Suspecting involvement of the Pakistan Army, Indian forces started reacting to this occupation. This led to a confrontation between the two countries. This is known as the Kargil conflict, and this conflict went on during May between the two countries. This is known as the Kargil conflict. This conflict went on during May and June 1999. By 26 July 1999, India had recovered control of many of the lost points, and the Kargil conflict drew attention worldwide for the region that only 1 year prior to that, both India and Pakistan had attained nuclear capability. However, this conflict remained confined only to the Kargil region. In Pakistan, this conflict has been the source of a major controversy, as it was alleged later that the Prime Minister of Pakistan was kept in the dark by the army chief. Soon after the conflict, the government of Pakistan was taken over by the Pakistan Army, led by the Army Chief General Pervez Musharraf. We were discussing support for the Pakistan came from the US and China, and the US China reapproachment that began in the late 1960s resulted in a realignment of forces in Asia. Henry Kissinger, and the advisor to the US President Richard Nixon, made a secret visit to China via Pakistan in July 1971. In order to counter the US Pakistan China axis, India signed a 20-year treaty of peace and friendship with the Soviet Union in August 1971. This treaty assured India of Soviet support if the country faced any attack. After months of diplomatic tension and military buildup, a full-scale war between the India and Pakistan broke out in December 1971. Pakistani aircrafts attacked Punjab and Rajasthan while the army moved on the Jammu and Kashmir front. India retaliated with an attack involving the Air Force, Navy, and the Army on both the Western and the Eastern Front. Welcomed and supported by the local population, the Indian Army made rapid progress in East Pakistan. Within 10 days, the Indian Army had surrounded Dhaka from three sides, and the Pakistani Army of about 19,000 had to surrender, with Bangladesh as a free country. India declared a unilateral ceasefire later. The signing of the Shimla Agreement between Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto on 3 July 1972 formalized the return of peace. A decisive victory in the war led to national jubilation. Most people in India sorry. After months of diplomatic tension and military buildup, a full-scale war between India and Pakistan broke out in December 1971. Pakistani aircraft attacked Punjab and Rajasthan while the army moved on the Jammu and Kashmir front. India retaliated with an attack involving the Air Force, Navy, and the Army on both the Western and the Eastern Front. Welcomed and supported by the local population, the Indian Army made rapid progress in East Pakistan. Within 10 days, the Indian Army had surrounded Dhaka from three sides, and the Pakistani army of about 90,000 has to surrender, with Bangladesh as a free country. India declared a unilateral ceasefire later, and the signing of the Shimla. I don't have water near me. Okay, thank you for advising. With Bangladesh as a free country, India declared a unilateral ceasefire. Later, the signing of the Shimla Agreement between Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto on 3 July 1972 formalized the return of peace. A decisive victory in the war led to national jubilation. Most people in India saw this as a moment of glory and a clear sign of India's growing military prowess. As you would read in the next chapter, Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister at this time. She had already won the Lok Sabha elections in 1971. Her personal popularity soared further after the 1971. After the war, assembly elections in most states took place, bringing large majorities for the Congress party in many states. India, with its limited resources, had initiated development planning. However, conflicts with neighbors derailed the 5-year plans and discards. India, with its limited resources, had initiated development planning. However, conflicts with neighbors derailed the 5-year plans. The scarce resources were diverted to the defense sector, especially after 1962, as India had to embark on a military modernization drive. The Department of Defense Production was established in November 1962, and the Department of Defense Supplies in November 1965. The third plan, 1961 to 1966, was affected, and it was followed by 3 annual plans, and the fourth plan could be initiated only in 1969. India's defense expenditure increased enormously after the wars. India's nuclear policy. Another crucial development of this period was the first nuclear explosion undertaken by the India in May 1974. Nehru had always put his faith in science and technology for the rapidly building a modern India. A significant component of his industrialization plans was the nuclear program. Nuclear program initiated in the late 1940s under the guidance of Homi J. Bhabha. India wanted to generate atomic energy for the peaceful purposes. Nehru was against nuclear weapons, so he pleaded with the superpowers for the comprehensive nuclear disarmament. However, the nuclear arsenal kept rising when Communist China conducted nuclear tests in October 1964. The five nuclear weapons powers the US, USSR, UK, France, and China, Taiwan then represented China. Also, the five permanent members of the UN Security Council tried to impose the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT) of 1968 on the rest of the world. India always considered the NPT, that is Non-Proliferation Treaty, as discriminatory and had refused to sign it. When India conducted its first nuclear test, it was termed as a peaceful explosion. India argued that it was committed to the policy of using nuclear power only for the peaceful purposes. The period when the nuclear test was conducted was a difficult period in domestic politics. Following the Arab Israel War of 1973, the entire world was affected by the oil shock due to the massive hike in the oil prices by the Arab nations. It led to the economic turmoil in India, resulting in high inflation. As you will read in chapter 6, many agitations were going on in the country around this time, including a nationwide railway strike. Although there are minor differences among political parties about how to conduct external relations, India politics is generally marked by a broad agreement among the parties on national integration, protection of international boundaries, and on the question of national interest. Therefore, we find that in the course of the decade of 1962 to 1971, when India faced three wars or even later when different parties came to power from time to time, foreign policy has played only a limited role in the party politics. Now, fast forward India's nuclear program. India has opposed the international treaties aimed at non-proliferation since they were selectively applicable to the non-nuclear powers and legitimized the monopoly of the five nuclear weapons powers. Thus, India opposed the indefinite extension of the NPT in 1995 and also refused to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty (CTBT). India conducted a series of nuclear tests in May 1998, demonstrating its capacity to use the nuclear energy for the military purposes. Pakistan soon followed, thereby increasing the vulnerability of the region to a nuclear exchange. And the international community was extremely critical of the nuclear tests in the subcontinent, and sanctions were imposed on both India and Pakistan, which were subsequently waived. India's nuclear doctrine of credible minimum nuclear deterrence professes no first use and reiterates India's commitment to the global, verifiable, and non-discriminatory nuclear disarmament, leading to a nuclear weapons-free world. Now, shifting alliances in the world politics. As you will read in the chapter 6 and also in the chapter 9, many known Congress governments came to power in the period starting 1977. This was also the time when world politics was changing dramatically. What did it mean for the India's external relations? The Janata Party government that came to power in 1977 announced that it would follow genuine non-alignment. This implied that the pro-Soviet tilt in the foreign policy will be corrected. Since then, all governments, Congress or non-Congress, have taken initiatives for the restoring better relations with the China and entering into the close ties with the US. In Indian politics and in popular mind, India's foreign policy is always very closely linked to two questions. One is India's stand vis-a-vis Pakistan and the other is Indo-US relations in the post-1990 period. The ruling parties have often been criticized for their pro-US foreign policy. Foreign policy is always dictated by the ideas of national interest. In the period after 1990, Russia, though it continues to be an important friend of India, has lost its global preeminence. Therefore, India's foreign policy has shifted to a more pro-US strategy. Besides, the contemporary international situation is more influenced by economic interests than by military interests, and this has also made an impact on the India's foreign policy choices. At the same time, Indo-Pakistan relations have witnessed many new developments during this period. While Kashmir continues to be the main issue between the two countries, and there have been many efforts to restore normal relations, and this means that the cultural exchanges, movement of the citizens, and economic cooperation would be encouraged by both these countries. Do you know that a train and a bus service operate between these two countries? And this has been a major achievement of the recent times, but that could not avoid the near war situations from emerging in 1999. Even after the setbacks to the peace process, efforts at negotiating durable peace have been going on. Thank you so much for watching and stay connected. Bye. I am going to take my breakfast now. Thank you for watching.